Paul, Paul Moss, a very warm welcome to Plantae Convivi's In Convivium interview series. You've been on my list for quite some time, uh, and this is number seven, so we're 7 months in. I don't know what the significance of
Wow.
seven is necessarily, but it feels like a nice landmark. Now, I invited you on because one of the facets of your human existence is as the executive director of the wonderful Plant Initiative, which is an organization that very much embodies the kind of spirit of Plantae Convivi, of us expressing our human agency through and with our plant kin rather than over them. And both that organization and your own self have been very, very supportive to me in my own kind of vegetal journey. So that was another reason to have you on, as well as to promote the plant initiative as a community and as a network. And we'll come to the plant initiative in a short while, but I wanted to just I always like to acknowledge, as is becoming the norm really in our amongst our tribe, of the local ecology, and where I am in North Devon in England, the kind of underlying natural vegetal expression is that of temperate deciduous rainforest. Now, I've never been to Minnesota. I've been to a number of US states, but never Minnesota. So it'd be lovely to kind of just get a bit of a feel for what's the kind of optimal underlying expression of vegetation, whether it's I guess forests mainly, but there may be other ecosystems as well in that part of the world. And I have to also flag up, you have a wonderful surname. You're not the only acquaintance slash friend of mine now in this vegetal tribe who has a vegetal name, and it's really kind of wonderful. Sydney Kale would be another example. But so yeah, some little insights on your local ecology from the vegetal point of view, and that wonderful surname of yours.
Sure. Well, Minnesota has three basic vegetation zones in it. We have in the Northeast, there's a coniferous forest where we have spruce and pine and trees like that, kind of more like a boreal forest. And then we have a strip running diagonally through the state that has that has deciduous forest. So you'd have oak trees, maple trees, things like that. And then in the southern part, especially Southwest, you have prairie. So it has three major zones in Minnesota. So it's very diverse and it's kind of a wonderful place in terms of, what you see about plants. Now, most of the landscape is covered with agricultural plants. So especially in the deciduous forest zone and the prairie zone, or what was formerly prairie. So if you were to drive through Minnesota, you would see a lot of plants, but a lot would be corn and soybeans. In terms of my name, thanks. It actually was shortened from my grandfather came from Romania, and he shortened the name from Moscovich to Moss. But I feel like there's definitely been an effect of having a plant name in my life, and that it does kind of steer you towards working with plants. I think when your actual name is the name of a plant, I think it kind of gives you this subconscious reinforcement. And I've seen other examples besides even Sydney Kale of people that have plant related last names and kind of are working in the area of plants. So it's kind of in a way, I think that plants show agency over humans is sometimes when they get when you have a name that relates to them.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. I want to acknowledge the grass in the image, your background image as well. I'm imagining it's a type of grass. I was at an event, one of Resurgence's local events here in North Devon last evening with my family, and it was looking at biofluorescence, which is distinct from bioluminescence. And really interesting. I'd never kind of experienced what it's like to see plants through, or with the aid of UV light, after dark, and they appear very, very differently. Many plants are the kind of chlorophyll translates into various shades of red, really kind of deep blood red, some of them. But the grasses, interestingly, are a kind of, it almost brings a new meaning to bluegrass. Because
Hmm.
it's that grey blue. I don't know if you've ever seen kind of biofluorescing grass at
No,
night, and quite different. And as it was described to us last evening, that's down to having certain chemicals. The English ivy that we had as well in the woodlands we were walking through had that bluey grey tinge to it as well. And this is apparently is down to chemicals within the leaves that prevent grazing, and herbivory, which of course is obvious with grasses. And it's interesting that that phytochemistry translates into a different kind of color expression. Anyway, but I wanted to acknowledge the grasses behind you, and we'll come to you mentioned the crops. We'll come to the corn a bit later because you also work with corn as well. But let's speak about the plant initiative because it's now, I think you were saying in an interview I saw of yours the other day, works out at about maybe 5 years old now. Is that right?
yeah, yeah, it's about right.
So,
We started it at the end of December 2020, and but it really kind of took off more after there was a conference in June of 2021 toward a new way of being with plants, and the talks were many great talks there from about 30 people, and they're all still available on our YouTube channel if anyone wants to watch them. We had a number of people that were very interesting talking. But in any case, as a result of that, we wanted to kind of institutionalize the people that are interested in plants around the world and having a different kind of relationship with plants. So we formed the nonprofit even before that conference, but the goal was that the nonprofit would follow up from that conference and would create a central point where people could that were interested in different ways and more respectful ways of working with plants and being with plants could have a central point of information, of connecting with each other. It'd be an educational resource. We give out grants also to organizations in the United States that are working on this kind of area. And so it's been an effort that's kind of evolved over the last several years. We're all volunteers. No one is paid anything as part of the plant initiative, and we're on a pretty small budget. And it's been, I think, working pretty well in terms of reaching people and encourage people to subscribe to our monthly newsletter or to come to our free events. And we appreciate that you, Pete, were featured in one of our events, and it's just an opportunity to highlight people like you that are doing really great work and looking at plants in a unique and special way.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it was an honor to be involved, and very much a surprise to me, really, because as I look at the caliber of your guests, I was like, goodness me, uh, they've invited me. But no, it was great. It was just an honor to be involved, and you have some great speakers. Your newsletter that you referenced, which I would highly recommend people to sign up to, and we will link the website in the show notes, as they say, is so rich with resources and opportunities and actions, and that comes in every month, isn't it? I think once a month.
Yep, every month we try and send it out on the 15th of the month.
Yes, and it's full of stuff, full of amazing vegetal goodness, and there's crossover as well because you're not the only. I think there's a lot of connectivity that's being kind of ramping up in our age, in our time now, and all to the good. And you're not the only kind of emergent network for what I and others refer to as vegetal tribe, because you've got, there's a lot of overlap, not just in personnel and people as well, because you've got the networking with plants in the Anthropocene, which is another one I know.
Correct.
And there's probably others as well in different, non-English speaking cultures. I don't know if you know of any.
Not English speaking cultures, no, but I know that there are certainly if you look through the events, that we feature, you'll see that they might not be positioning themselves in the same way like Yoella Jacobs has the literary and cultural plant studies network. which is a great listserv, which people might want to find that. That's through the University of Arizona. And there's definitely other organizations and people that are thinking about plants and connecting people that are interested in plants. But I think in terms of actually framing the whole organization's work on increasing respect for plants, I don't I think there's people that resonate with that goal, but I don't know that there's other organizations that I'm aware of that that's their only focus.
Mm. Well, and one of the things I really love about both the networks we've mentioned is that it kind of it's such a mix. You've got academics like yourself, and I mean, although you're probably a little bit more liminal than a strict academic, I suspect. You've got artists, you've got people from all sorts of backgrounds involved, and it kind of gives the lie to the fact that plant communication, for example, is it's woo woo, and there's really serious and interesting conversations being had. And I just seeing the references in your monthly newsletter, there's a lot of academic institutions taking plant intelligence, plant communication, plant rights, plant ethics, all these interrelated subjects and issues really seriously.
Yeah, I think that's true. And we really have tried at the Plant Initiative to be inclusive of alternative ways of knowing. So in terms of intuitive plant communication, we had a large event, featuring many people. I think there was about 8 people or more that are plant communicators. And in terms of indigenous perspectives, in terms of rights of nature, as you point out, anything that has to do with plants that could help to break down maybe some of the ways that people see plants in just instrumental ways, in just objectifying them, and to make them, have more of a connection with plants. And so I think that it's important to go beyond just the intellectual and the academic, and to include all other ways of knowing and relating to plants as well.
Mm. In terms of, plant rights and plant ethics, which certainly in our circles we're hearing an awful lot more about, as a subset of the rights of nature. But it seems to me it's kind of inevitable that, I mean, looking at the bigger picture items like for women and rights for people of color and animal rights, inevitably we're going to get to plant rights, enshrined plant rights, and even beyond, and we're starting to get that with the rights of nature for, rivers. And do you sense that that's, and it may take a while yet, but that it's inevitable that we'll kind of increasingly deepen that, manifest that reality?
I hope so. I hope so. I'm hesitant to say that anything is inevitable at this point in the world, because the world goes in ways that I can't really understand. And I'd like to think that there is like a progression towards more respectful rights for all beings, and that plants are just going to be one step towards that. But I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. But I do think that there are some parallel tracks that are going in the world right now. And I think one of these tracks is, as you're pointing out, with rights of nature. And even in Minnesota, there has been efforts to, and actually there's some work going on right now in our Minnesota legislature to recognize the rights of wild rice. And it's getting some pushback as well. But there are some of the indigenous nations in Minnesota have recognized the rights of wild rice, and in their own legal structure, it is recognized on their reservation. But there's been efforts to try and incorporate that into Minnesota state law. And so I think that I'd like to believe that we're on a trajectory in which, as we move forward, there's going to be more and more inclusion in who is respected, and including, animals and plants and microorganisms, I would say, and minerals and the air and water. I'd like to see all of that, included in how people recognize rights. But I'm not sure that it's inevitable, and I think that it's going to be a choice that us as a humanity, as the human species, is going to have to make in terms of which of these paths they're going to go on and for how long they're going to go on these paths. So
Mm.
I'm hopeful, but I'm not confident. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I think since the pandemic, one of my favorite phrases has been "We'll see." You know, we'll see. But it's interesting some of the language that's used now. I mean, one of the terms that I've heard you use, which of course we're familiar with in terms of, although it's not necessarily commonly used, animal liberation. But when you kind of add that word liberation to plants, it's kind of like, oh, it catches people because we generally have, as a society, modern society anyway, this, plant blindness, which has become a more of a mainstream term now. We just, yeah, it's kind of catching us to think, oh yeah, wow, you know, why shouldn't plants have have rights and be considered? And of course, the plant intelligence research is kind of coming in behind this. But of course, there's um, people who are very on side with them general environmental issues, like vegans, for example, who all of a sudden can start to feel quite threatened about, what do you mean we shouldn't be eating plants? And of course, that's not the case. And people like Michael Marder have been doing some great work saying, this is important. We have to consider plant rights, plant ethics, and have a position on it. And we need to talk about it. But it doesn't mean we're going to stop eating plants, And a lot of people kind of speak. This is where we have to kind of be inspired by the indigenous ways in terms of the honourable harvest, for example. But it's just having the conversations and talking about it without necessarily kind of coming down hard on a particular, this is right and this is wrong.
Yeah, I think that right. I would agree that right now, especially given how polarized a lot of the discourses in the world, that coming down strong for positions that are threatening to large groups of people is not going to be very productive. So I
Mm.
think that I think that with the Plan Initiative and otherwise, I believe it's kind of having a we're somewhat at the early phases of thinking about this issue. And so more about kind of a consciousness raising issue, kind of asking people to think about it, to ask questions, to maybe question some of the ways that they've been thinking about plants, and to move things forward in that way versus to, try and come up with restrictions or make people feel uncomfortable with what they're doing. Not that it's not okay if people feel uncomfortable with what they're doing, but as a goal for an outreach effort, I'm not sure that's going to be all that effective. And I think you're right. I mean, in terms of the animal rights movement, there's been some concerns from people in that movement about plants being recognized as having rights because of the feeling that it will raise that kind of question that you've mentioned. It's like, well, what can we eat anyway? If everything we eat is being harmed by us and is feeling pain or whatever, then why it weakens some of the arguments that I think that they've been using in terms of that we need to just protect, sentient beings and beings that can feel pain. So it can be somewhat threatening. Although I think the issue is with veganism, and I certainly support veganism. I'm not a vegan myself, but I also don't, I would consider myself a vegetarian. I think that, it really you are going to kill less plants if you don't eat meat. So I think that that's one argument is that you still, even if you're going to be, eating animal products and eating meat, it because of the inefficiency of agriculture. If you eat plants directly, it's going to be more efficient than trying to run all that energy from the plant in through an animal and then eating the animal or its products.
Mm, mm, mm. Um, you mentioned earlier speaking of food crops, and there's probably a little interjection here as well, because I think some plants may be granted rights sooner than others. I mean, as you know, some of my favorite plants are what I refer to as the plantae non gratae, those unwelcome plants, the weeds and invasives. I suspect they will be the last to be given to be granted rights, but who knows, in this world. But yeah, no, you mentioned we mentioned crops earlier, and you're like us all, a multifaceted human being, and there are other ways that you work with plants in your daily and academic existence, and particularly with your dissertation topic there at the University of Minnesota. Do you want to say a little bit about your work with corn?
Sure. Well, I think, one of the challenges of thinking about plants differently is that as you point out, Pete, there are certain plants that it's a lot easier to feel a connection with, like an ancient tree that's, hundreds of feet tall, or a special historical tree, or a rare or endangered plant, or a very beautiful plant with, that people really like and have sentimental feelings towards. And then as you're pointing out, there's other plants where they're maybe either disliked, like what are considered weeds, or they're just kind of considered as commercial products and commercial tools, really, for making money out of them. And so what I wanted to do is to talk with people that are involved with growing corn or otherwise involved with corn here in Minnesota, and to just kind of interview them and ask them some questions just about, raising some of these issues about, plant ethics with them, not in a heavy-handed way, because most were farmers and hadn't really thought about corn in a way that it makes it, look like a sensitive living being that maybe deserves rights and respect, or, they've just been thinking about it as a crop. And so talking to them and just asking them questions, like, what to what extent what would you think about plants maybe in corn in that way, or do you think that how do you think that growers should treat a corn respectfully? How do you think that corn would want to be grown? And so I had conversations with 31 people in terms of doing this research for my project. And it was very interesting because people are not that one-dimensional. A lot of people have, various types of experiences. Some people have had, connections with Indigenous people, with their way of thinking, with maybe some of their religious and spiritual beliefs. And so there was definitely some openness among people that are even who are mostly just dealing with corn as a crop for money, and in terms of potentially thinking about it as something more than that.
Mhm. And just to be clear for the non-American audience members, whether it's whenever they get to see this, the corn we're referring to would be Zea maize, to use the scientific.
Correct, correct,
Mhm.
correct. And I'm sorry because I realize in other countries corn is refers to other types of plants, but in the
It-
United States it's maize,
yeah,
and
yeah.
so it's that very large grass plant that's grown for typically, for grain, for animal feed, or for ethanol here in the United States, or
Mm.
for industrial purposes. Some
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
grown for human consumption, a little bit
So
for sweet corn, but not that much.
I'm guessing that perhaps in part you were inspired because there's quite a famous within our circles female scientist who ultimately made her name with researching on corn, and that's Barbara McClintock, of course, whose work was shunned at the time by her male colleagues, I believe, but she was later given the Nobel Prize for her work on the genetics of corn. Um, yeah, I mean, was she an inspiration to you in terms of? I mean, your focus is slightly different, but
Well, to some extent, I mean, I think looking at corn or other plants as active agents and as potential partners and helpers for humans, I think she's a good example in that, she really developed an emotional connection with corn, and felt like through almost like an intuitive sense that the corn was trying to help her understand how genes moved in their plants. And so she was kind of corn essentially she felt, I believe, revealed some of their genetic secrets to her. And it was, I think, through this kind of emotional connection that she had. And corn is a really unusual plant in that it was kind of a, wouldn't say it's like a human invention, but it was always a partnership between the grass and the indigenous people in Mexico who created it thousands of years ago. So it's always had this very close connection with humans. It needs humans to be able to reproduce it because the seeds are so tight on the cob. If the cob just falls, it can't spread itself. So it needs to be planted, it needs to be cultivated, but it's always been, and getting back to the issue of honorable harvest, but it's always been a situation where there's almost been a contract uh, uh, between corn and humans, and that, corn would give certain things to humans, and then in a sense of reciprocity, humans would give some things back to corn. And I think what's happened now for corn and probably a lot of the other crop plants is that it's become more of a one-way street where it's just the humans taking what they want from the plant and really not giving anything back to the plant, except maybe just letting it have its physical needs met, but not giving it like the emotional and respectful accord that it deserves. So I think that's a kind of a dangerous situation. And I think that with corn, there's been a lot of negative consequences towards treating corn disrespectfully, whether it's because of the kind of environmental damage that comes from over fertilizing or using pesticides, or some of the health issues that have occurred with corn. I mean, it's kind of like with tobacco. It's like when you have a plant that's essentially a sacred being, and then you kind of use it for unintended consequences, that there's negative implications to that, for you. And so I think that getting back to a sense of needing to treat corn respectfully would help both humans and corn, and
Mm.
avoid some of the more negative consequences that have been involved with, massive industrial corn production.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, many listeners will be familiar with the ancient Three Sisters method of growing corn with beans and squash. A very elegant and efficient indigenous system. And who knows whether we can get back to that, at scale or not. But oh, I had a good question, but it's gone. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? What do you think? What would be the your dream outcome and kind of the dream ripples that your PhD would create? Do you think, even if it's just in Minnesota? I know you're kind of looking across the border in Wisconsin as well.
Um, you know, I'd like to see people start to think of crop plants in a different way.
Mm,
A long time ago, I have a degree in agronomy uh,
mm,
from Penn State back in 1990. And, I've always been connected to some extent with agriculture, and I feel like agricultural plants are kind of not receiving the kind of respect that they need as living organisms. So I would hope that maybe some ripple effects, could occur from some of the discussions that I've been having. I'd like to have a kind of a program for the plant initiative, maybe talking about corn or other crop plants in terms of some of the ethical issues in terms of how the plants are treated. And maybe that would be one way that could kind of expand beyond just a dissertation that I don't know who will ever read it. So, I mean, I think the key is with outreach, and that's why it's important that you are doing programs like this, and trying to reach out to people and just kind of get them to think about things differently, expose them to different ideas, then maybe they would just have have come to on their own. So I think it's really important, that
Mm.
you provide that opportunity for people to kind of just, start thinking about things differently.
Well, hopefully all the people like me, and there seems to be more and more people like me doing this kind of thing in different spheres will help. Yeah, drip feed that into more of a drips becoming a flood in the mainstream perhaps. But I remember what I wanted to ask about because obviously the ancient Americans were breeding corn. And obviously, its corn's become notorious in more recent times because of a different kind of breeding. And
Hmm.
obviously, I'm talking about genetic modification. Do you want to maybe draw a distinction, if and as you see it, between those two kinds of breeding, what we might describe as slow and fast, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I think indigenous people are still breeding corn, and there's still, and there's other people that are still breeding open pollinated corn varieties. And so I think it's not just in the past that there has
Okay.
been kind of an ongoing as you're saying, more slower or natural way of breeding corn. But I think in terms of GMO, I think to me that goes beyond what is respectful. That it doesn't respect the corn's genome. It doesn't respect the corn's ability to have progeny, like itself. It's introducing foreign genetic materials into the corn. I don't know that anyone has respectfully asked corn, before doing genetically modified response experiments on corn genetics, if that's okay with corn. I don't know what kind of answer they would hear from corn, but that would be an appropriate way to address that question. I mean, I would say that there are people that can intuitively communicate with plants, or even just using your imagination to think about what would corn think about getting genes introduced into it from bacteria or animals or other plants. Does that feel comfortable for corn to do that, to just be an object of laboratory manipulation? My guess is probably no. It probably Corn would say that that's not the way we were designed. That's not respectful. It's too one way. What are we getting out of this? I don't know. I mean, I think that corn, so I think looking at it from the plant's perspective as to whether or not they would want to have genetically modified, material introduced. I mean, I don't know that most people would really like that very well. It's just trying to think about, is that a respectful thing to do? And is that something we should be entitled to just because we can't, just because we can do it?
Mm.
And shouldn't we be limiting ourselves to things that are more appropriate?
When a twin question here, which may lead us in a different direction as well, but it follows on. Is there a moment in your life where you first, this whole idea of, wow, I should be um, asking permission from the rosemary bush outside before I just, grab a sprig for supper? Um, and in fact, I picked a couple of bay leaves this evening and didn't ask. So this is a journey that's still very fresh and new to me, and I forget constantly. And I'm sure I'm not alone, even within our kind of community, in forgetting to kind of see these beings as, sentient, let's say, and to ask permission. I'm certainly grateful, and I express that on a regular basis. And sometimes, maybe these kind of communications and feelings pass along the lines on kind of subquantum or quantum kind of channels. I don't know, but it's still good to kind of voice these things. But was there a moment when you kind of first kind of like, oh my goodness, I need to have a different relationship with plants? And the kind of the second aspect to that, was there an earlier moment in your life, perhaps in childhood, when even if it's in hindsight, you realize that plants were kind of reaching out to you?
That's a good question. I don't know that there was a specific moment. I think it kind of occurred somewhat gradually. I think having just personal experiences with intuitive communication with plants. I
Mm,
think that that was very transformative. And that occurred, more when I was an adult. And, under at least the way it feels to me is that I, you know, can communicate with plants, ask them questions, get a response. And so it makes me feel more that we're dealing with like beings here that are, they're intelligent, they have their own agendas. I think they really like humans in most cases. They want to partner with humans, they want to collaborate, they want to be treated respectfully. I think also being exposed as an adult to indigenous ways of thinking has really affected me too. Things like you would read in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book Braiding Sweetgrass, but also, other experiences as well. I think that they really have a very different way of dealing with other living beings. And it's not that they don't harvest them or they don't eat them or use them, but it's done in a context where they're sacred relatives and that they are, of importance. So I think it gets into kind of issues of like spirituality, effects from indigenous people, and also just kind of, feeling an intuitive sense about the way that plants, see the world and what they kind of request from humans, in return. So I think it was those kinds of things. Although I've always really liked plants, and so I've always been drawn to them, but I don't think it was in terms of this kind of more ethical issue that came later in my life.
Okay, thank you. Um, I'd love to ask you a bit more about the intuitive communication because, yeah, I think for many people that might need a little bit more explanation in terms of like what exactly is that? What does it look like? What does it feel like?
Okay. Sure. I think for people, everyone, it would be different. I guess I believe that everyone has the ability to communicate intuitively with other beings, including plants. And it's basically involves for me, it involves, making creating a plant or making contact with a plant, and if it feels like it's appropriate, asking the plant, for permission to talk or to communicate with the plant. And then really for me it's just in my own mind asking questions, and then in my own mind not hearing with my ears but getting a response in words in terms of what the plant would be answering. So it's like that's something that I feel I've done for many years, and I respect that. And I really think that if people are open to, just that concept of, having with an open mind approaching a plant, ask, if it feels like a polite thing to do, and to ask a question, and especially if it's something that you need or important information that you would like to get, and then seeing what response you get in your own mind. Now, it could be a person's imagination, or it could be coming from your own deeper subconscious intuitive self, or it could be coming from the plant. In my opinion, it for my experience, it's things that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. At least I'm not aware of it, and I feel that it's been helpful. So I think and I really do believe that plants want to communicate with people and are happy to do it. And maybe not all plants at all times. So, we did, as I mentioned, we did last summer a conference, an online event where we had, I don't know, there was maybe about a dozen plant communicators, and it's still, all of the recordings are on our YouTube channel, and you would hear from a number of people talking about their personal experiences with plant communication. It's not that uncommon, and I think for also indigenous people is something that they've done in part of their culture. But what I've done or other people in our mainstream culture, it's just been more, on an individual basis. It hasn't necessarily been through an indigenous cultural context.
Yeah, it's was that the event you referred to, was that the Voices of Plants?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a fabulous event. And what came across to me, amongst other things, was that there's so many different ways of communicating with plants. And it kind of it starts to dawn on you that actually some of the ways are actually very straightforward, and we might ourselves be doing it and have done it already and just not realized, if you see what I mean.
Sure.
And
Mhm.
yeah, no, I'd certainly recommend people check that out. The YouTube videos. It was a very rich, best part of a day, wasn't it? All told.
Yeah, yeah, and it was we entitled it "Voices of Plants for a Better World," and the idea was is that plants can be allies. You know, we're facing a lot of problems in our world today, and plants are unfortunately going to be subject to a lot of the negativity that's in the world, whether it's through wars or climate change or whatever. And so I think that plants are interested in working with humans, and so it's a kind of a two-way street. So I think that plants and humans can collaborate, hopefully in addressing some of the problems that we're seeing right now in the world.
Mm. I'm just gonna. We're losing our light
Are
slightly
you
here
okay?
now. Yeah, it's which is great. So there we go, a little bit more light on the matter. But we're actually having some wonderful sunshines and spring warmth at last after a very, 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 very long winter. I think you were saying the other day in an email that you've still got plenty of snow there.
You know, today we've still got snow on the ground here in Minnesota a little bit, but it's melting quickly, and we're very happy because we're ready for spring. And today, I think, is officially the first day of spring.
Yeah, well, yes, we're very close to the equinox, if not right on it, aren't we? Um, I had another question for you, but that's gone. The right words appear when they need to, I guess. But thinking back to the plant initiative, what would be your dream outcomes for the next, I don't know, 5 years, let's say, in terms of what that community generates?
Yeah, I'd like to see it continue to do what it's doing now to grow, to continue attracting new people. We have our mailing list has over 5,000 people on it right now, and we have, thousands of people following it on social media on X, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, and I feel that, continuing to put this message out there about we need to rethink the way that we're interacting with plants. I'd like to see more partnership with the animal advocacy community, if that's possible. I think we've are open to that, and there are definitely people in the animal advocacy community that support the kind of things that we're doing with plants. But I think the idea of breaking down these boundaries between the beings that count and the beings that don't count so much. You know what I mean? So I think for within humans, there's obviously many, many examples of people that are considered other that are being treated poorly, and their interests are being disregarded. You can see that in the news every day. But there's also, when we include animals in our sphere of moral consideration, ethical consideration, that's great. But then there's still a line, and there's a line where, is it sentient animals that we care about, animals that feel pain, and what about, animals that maybe don't feel pain or aren't considered sentient. So, and then, then you get into plants and microorganisms and minerals. I guess I would like to see a kind of us move towards an ethical way of looking at all the other beings on Earth as every being, whatever form it's taking, is deserving of being treated respectfully, and
Yeah.
whether it's a mineral, whether it's a plant, an animal, or another human. So I'd like to see it moving. I'd like to see our society moving towards that, because I think that's why I feel it's all connected. The way we treat plants and the way that we treat people, it's all connected. Again, you've got this line that's being drawn where plants don't really matter, but people do. But if we need to stop drawing lines. And I think a lot of indigenous people don't really draw those lines. They just see all beings as relatives, as needing to be treated respectfully, whether it's water or air or plants. And I think we have to move towards that. And that if we can do that, then we'll solve the problems of war and hatred and bigotry. If we can look at all beings as deserving of respect. And so kind of have what the plant initiative is doing being broadened in terms of both in terms of microorganisms and fungi and other non-quote living beings and also making the connection with what's going on between humans.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're not alone. I think a strong aspect of the emerging zeitgeist is the blurring of all those boundaries. I mean, all the work on the gut microbiome, really kicked
Hmm.
that off.
Hmm.
Certainly as I see it. But then there's been some great things written, and a lot of it from the scientific community as well. But I know you may have read it, the book Inflamed. Um,
No, I haven't read that.
that came out just a few years ago. Rupa Maria and Raj Patel, I think. One was an economist, the other a physician. But there was a great, I mean, it's a fantastic book that kind of like, that blurred lots of lines, but at the same time connected, um, us with our environment and the milieu and all the rest of it. But there's a lovely quote that really spoke to me. The modern biology, and in the context of uh, I forget the subtitle of their book, but it was deep medicine and to do with inflammation and all this kind of thing across scales in all the way that inflammation, our planet, our societies, our bodies are all inflamed at this point. But yes, at modern biology, and they suggested the medical sciences that are based from, or that arise from it, represents an epic misrecognition of self and other.
You mean in terms of the fact that there's so many microorganisms living in our body and we're kind of hybrid beings anyway? Is that what you mean?
Exactly, and you can just take it out fractally into the world around us,
Mhm.
But I love that, an epic, and that's the word they used, misrecognition of self and other, and it's very easy for me, certainly, to step into the spiritual, outlook and worldview from that quote.
Well, I think you've been talking about Gaia in general, for a long time. So I think it's this idea. I mean, again, that's looking at it from a bigger picture in that we're all components of this other bigger living being. And so why should we be acting destructively or disrespectfully towards other elements of the same being that we're a part
Mm,
of? You know,
mm,
why it doesn't make sense. Again, it's that kind of looking fractally at this. So it's all connected, and I think that hopefully people looking at plants in a different way will kind of see some of those connections and won't draw the line at plants.
mm.
They'll continue to look at this all as one big interconnected, interwoven system, which needs to be respected in order for us to all survive.
Yeah, yeah, and it's certainly the kind of interrelationships between fungi or fungi, as you would say, perhaps, um, and the amazing work that's being done by people like Merlin Sheldrake, Suzanne Simard, etc.,
Mhm.
or et al., should I say? That it's seems to me it's imagery that can be more readily taken on board than some of the other instances where everything's blurred, such as the gut microbiome. You can go, oh, okay, wow, yes, where does one organism end and another begin? And I think it's all to the good that it's being blurred, and that say there's some great work, being done out there. And yes, it would be lovely, to see, from my perspective, to see more of that blurring being done with, the output from the plant initiative, for example, and having, maybe a speaker who can speak to a given aspect of blurring, or even to have two people who dance together in the same kind of interview to kind
Well,
of
in May, we're going to be talking with a primatologist who has written a
mm,
book on human exceptionalism. And I think part of that conversation, this will be, I believe, May 19th, is that, we'll be talking about, human exceptionalism affects obviously the way you look at everything on the planet. And I think that hopefully that's one way of like showing the broader context of what this work is. One thing I just want to mention is again to think about these weeds, and I think that's what is so important about your work is that you are trying to get people to, erase that line that with even within the plants about the kind of the good plants and then the bad plants. And then I think you're doing a really great service to all of those plants that are really filling their niche, their purpose in Gaia's existence, as you've explained it so well. And I think that's really an important message that people can stop kind of being negative and disrespectful towards these quote invasive plants or weeds or whatever, and to see that they all have a purpose within the bigger context. And then, in some cases, it's just a temporary, maybe growth that they will have in the ecosystem, and then they'll be replaced by something else. So it doesn't mean you have to always try and kill them, because they're doing the work that they needed to be doing. So I think I just want to applaud you for doing that. And there's so few people that are really taking that important perspective.
Mm. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. The Mutual Appreciation Society. So we're almost at the hour, and yeah, no, thank you again for all the support you do give me. What is the Plant Initiative web address?
Okay, it's simple, plantinitiative.org.
Brilliant.
So
Plantinitiative.org, and I would highly recommend people sign up for your newsletter. And yeah, Paul, thanks so much for being on this call, for accepting
thanks,
the
Pete. Yeah, I'm
invitation.
glad,
And
to do it, and keep up the good work too.
well, yeah, no, we'll speak again. We'll have you on, as they say, again for round two or whatever. Not that it's a fight. This is what we're moving away from, hopefully. Even though some, mainstream events would kind of direct us otherwise. But anyway, thank you so much, and for all involved, with the Plant Initiative. It's a great community, and I'm really honored and happy to be involved. So yes, until the next time, have a lovely weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, Paul.